You're tuned in to The Last Radio Show.
Hello and welcome to The Last Radio Show. I'm John Lynch.
I'm Jenn Reilly.
And this is the show where we talk about all kinds of things. We talk about pop culture. We talk about history. We talk about the news. Today, we are going to talk about Superman. Yeah, you know, the Man of Steel, faster than a speeding bullet, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound, look up in the sky. That's guy.
Superman.
That's Superman.
I know him as Clark Kent. Sorry.
Well, shh. Nobody's supposed to know that. He's got glasses on when he's Clark Kent, so you don't recognize him. So there's a new Superman movie coming out.
I haven't heard about it. Has it been highly publicized?
Yeah, a little bit. You know what? It's kind of a big deal. They think it's going to be like the big summer movie. A lot of people, you know. Of course, you know, so many superhero movies over the last few years, so I could see how you could miss one, you know, because there's been so many of them. But it's a new Superman. Henry Cavill's played him in the last few movies.
Okay.
It's a new actor. They're kind of rebooting the franchise.
Has there been like a new Superman movies in the last 10 years? I've missed it all.
We'll get into it. All right. So how much do you know about Superman in general? What do you know about him?
I'm just old school, like Clark Kent, Superman, Kryptonite. That's about it.
I mean, that's a big chunk of it. So of course there's the real world story of Superman, like the comic book company making him and all that kind of stuff. And then of course there's Superman's actual biography in the superhero universe.
Okay.
So, you know, the story is Kal-El, who is Superman's Kryptonian identity, was sent to Earth by his parents because Krypton, his home planet, was going to explode.
Yes.
And they didn't have any way to evacuate, but his father invented a rocket that was just big enough to carry him. So they sent him to Earth, and the sun of the Earth is a different color than Krypton, so that gives him superpowers. And Superman basically has like every superpower you can think of. He can fly. He's invulnerable. He can shoot heat vision. He can have ice breath. He can, you know, he's super strong and all this stuff. And super hearing, super vision, you know, he can see far away. So, you know, he's like he's Superman.
He's basically a Superman.
Hence the name. So he grew up in a town called Smallville. He was adopted by Earth parents who found him when his rocket crash landed in Kansas. So he's a farm boy from Kansas. And it was the Kent family that found him and raised him as their son, Clark.
Right.
Clark Kent moved to Metropolis, became a reporter. Worked with Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen, you know, his pals at the Daily Planet. And, you know, for years they didn't know who they were. In the comic books, Lois eventually found out and ended up marrying Superman in the comic books.
After she found out he was Superman.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. And so, you know, they found out that was a whole thing. And it's changed a few times in the comic books because they're always changing things in the comic books. But he fights Lex Luthor a lot. He fights Brainiac. He has all these villains. And Superman was essentially the first superhero.
Okay.
Like, of all the people that, you know, Batman and Iron Man and the Hulk and the Flash and all the superheroes you can name, he was the first one. He came out originally. The first story of Superman was published in 1938.
Oh, wow.
So this is like a long time ago, before World War II. I mean, this is a long, long time ago. These two artists named Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster came up with the character. They were freelance kind of cartoon guys who would write stories and draw comics. And they sold it to DC Comics, their first story with Superman, for $130. Now, spoiler alert. This is in the 30s, but still, spoiler alert, it's worth a lot more than that now. So that's been an ongoing thing that we'll get into in a little bit too.
Wait, they sold the rights, the story, everything, or just
they sold the story goes they sold them the story, the original story, and they threw in the rights for free because nobody knew any of this stuff was going to be worth money.
Right.
You know, nobody thought this was going to be.
So they were like, buy the story. We'll give you the rights.
Yeah, right? you can have the rights to it.
Sure.
Obviously, they regretted that a little bit later on, but we will get into that as we go along. So. Do you remember how many of the Superman movies do you think you've seen? Like you must have seen the Christopher Reeves one, the original one from 1978.
Oh, yeah, probably that's the only one.
That's probably the most iconic Superman, at least for people of our generation and beyond. It was, you know, Christopher Reeves did such an amazing job.
Yeah.
Of playing the character, and he actually made 4 Superman movies. The first 2 were great.
Okay.
The second two were terrible. I mean, essentially, they're.
I wonder which one I saw, because I'm pretty sure I only saw one.
Okay, so the first one basically is kind of his origin story, where he first goes to work in the Daily Planet. The very famous scene in it is when Lois Lane is falling out of a helicopter and he catches her.
Okay, yeah. Right.
And then he catches the helicopter as it's falling, and that's like his introduction as Superman.
Right.
And, Margot Kidder was Lois Lane in those movies. Great chemistry between the two of them.
Yeah.
And Gene Hackman was Lex Luthor.
Oh, right, okay.
He played that, and famously had hair because he didn't want to shave his head because Lex Luthor is supposed to be bald.
Oh,
but there is one scene where he takes his wig off and he shows his bald hair. So it's basically that's the classic one.
Yeah.
That kind of I think is basically the modern Superman is kind of based around that. Mm-hmm. And, the John Williams theme, is classic. Dun, 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 dun,
yes.
dun, dun, is just legendary. In the new movie, they're even using that classic theme again,
sure.
like a new version of it, just because that's kind of a signature thing.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to talk about John Williams at some point, because he's done like every movie ever. And
right.
like any theme, from a movie he wrote.
Yeah.
Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Jaws, Close Encounters, all those movies. He did all
right.
those.
And some of them Jaws is only 2 notes. Did you know that?
Yeah.
They were like the most frightening 2 notes. That's what the comedian said.
Became iconic kind of thing.
Amazing.
So Superman has been around since, like I said, the late 30s. He started out. In the 40s, they basically had him fighting World War II, beating up Nazis.
Just in the comic books.
In the comic books,
where it
they didn't actually send him.
Right. I mean, there was no other medium that he was just in comics at the time.
He was just in comics in the beginning. There was some radio shows and some serials, the weekly movie theater, things where there were like little 15-minute movies that they say come in next week, and they were usually like 15 or 20 chapters to get the kids to come in every Saturday and see them. So that was like his first exposure to the multimedium beyond the comic books.
Right.
And he had, like I said, he had the radio show. Then in the early 1950s, George Reeve starred in a Superman full-length movie that eventually became the Superman TV show from the 50s.
Okay.
And I remember there was always reruns of this on when I was a kid. I remember, and it was right around the time when I was a kid that the Christopher Reeves movie came out. They would put the old TV show on TV because everybody was kind of excited about Superman at that time. And what's interesting about that is it started in the 50s. It actually started out in black and white. And halfway through the series, it was in color. They actually changed it. So it was right around the time that color TV was being introduced.
Right.
And the George Reeves story is very, very, he basically essentially maybe killed himself, maybe was murdered right at the height of his popularity. And there's actually a movie about it that talks about his story that came out a couple of years ago, that Ben Affleck actually plays him in it, which is ironic because Ben Affleck actually eventually played Batman too. So it's kind of interesting that he's played Superman and Batman. But like you said, the big thing, he's kryptonite is Superman's weakness, because basically he was too powerful in the radio show. And the story goes that in the radio show, they were all done live back in those times. They weren't recorded. The actor who played Superman needed to take a few days off. So they introduced kryptonite so he could be put in a coma. So all the other actors were like, "Where's Superman? Superman, we got to save Superman."
Oh, they went on without him? He was in the coma?
They went on without him for a couple of weeks. And then when he came back, they said, "Oh, we'll get rid of this kryptonite and he'll be fine." And he was. Right. So but essentially that became such a big part of the lore of Superman.
So you have to have a weakness. I mean, a hero without a weakness is not.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And again, he's invulnerable. He's faster.
Right.
One of the problems with Superman is that he's just too strong. Mm-hmm. It's interesting when you look at the trailer for this new movie that's coming out next week. I believe it's supposed to be hitting theaters. It looks like they've depowered him a little bit. He's not quite as all powerful. They actually show him kind of getting beat up a little bit by some big monsters and stuff like that.
Okay, yeah.
So you got to make it so he can hopefully.
Yeah, you have to be able to cheer for him if you know he's going to win. What's the point?
He's got to overcome some odds at some point. So getting back to the rights of the character, the original people who Siegel and Schuster, who came up with it, they kept writing for Superman, and they did make quite a bit of money off the character.
Okay.
Reportedly, between 1938 and 1947, they wrote most of the Superman stories, and they made over $400,000, which, if you adjust it for inflation, this again in the 30s and 40s, that's over $7 million.
Okay.
So it's not like they were, destitute, and not like they weren't reimbursed properly, but they did always regret giving up the character because obviously there's a lot of money there, and they've sued DC Comics. They both have passed away now at this point. Right. But over the years, they had like lawsuits going back and forth with DC Comics.
Yeah, that would be like Walt Disney, like giving away Mickey Mouse.
Exactly. Essentially. But because they kept rewriting the stories, they kept adding like new characters into the mythology. Like they did versions of Superman when he was younger called Superboy comics when he was a teenager. And DC Comics didn't have the right to Superboy, so they had to buy those. There's a lot of legal wrangling going on.
Right.
And it's just kind of interesting to like see the whole dynamics of it. In the mid-'70s, when the movie was coming out, like that was a big payday.
Sure.
They were moving up from comic books to the big screen. And there was a lot of lawsuits then. Eventually, DC Comics did settle with them and said, like, listen, we're going to give you, X amount % of whatever Superman makes for the rest of your lives. Just don't sue us anymore.
Right.
Because they kept suing them quite a bit. So, again, the Christopher Reeves movie, to me, that is the ultimate Superman moment. It was really the first modern superhero movie. When you look at it now, we have like 4 or 5 of them that come out every year.
Yeah.
Between the Marvel universe and, the X-Men and, Superman and Batman and all these movies, Wonder Woman, they're all multiple movies. I read somewhere in the last 25 years, so since 2000, there have been over 100 movies based on DC or Marvel comics, which are the 2 big comics. So that's like 4 a year, essentially, on average. Plus, on top of that, you have animated shows, you have TV shows, and then streaming shows on top of just the movies. So this is a big business now. And again, it all started with Superman back in 1938.
And it's still influencing things like some of the animated cartoons that are like Megamind is really pretty much Superman, like the antithesis of that.
Definitely, and there's a popular streaming show called The Boys, which is kind of like a superhero show, but it's kind of more gritty and realistic, and there's a lot of things. And again, a lot of them, like whatever, like in different universes, like different comic book universes, whoever like the big strong guys, they're like, well, that's their Superman. That's their main guy. So
Superman is the original, right?
Yeah, exactly. And what's interesting about DC Comics is their 2 most popular characters by a long stretch are Superman and Batman. Obviously, we've seen all the movies and TV shows about both those characters, and they're very, very different in their skill sets. You know, because Batman's a regular guy. He doesn't have superpowers. He's rich, and he's trained himself to be this peak physical specimen, but he doesn't have any
powers at all.
He doesn't. He's a regular guy. He doesn't have any power. There's a great line with Ben Affleck actually playing Batman in the Justice League movie, where somebody asked him what his superpowers was, and he says, "I'm rich." And so it would basically be if Elon Musk decided to become a superhero, which maybe he will. We don't know. He does some weird stuff, but that's a whole other topic for another day. But so it's very much a yin and yang between Batman and Superman, and beyond the powers that they have, the tone of both of them are very different. Superman is very positive and very, bright and, good natured. He's a farm boy from Kansas, like an all shucks kind of guy. Batman can be kind of dark and mysterious.
Right, sure.
And, kind of cynical, and he's like, he grew up in the city, so it's a very interesting dynamic. And they've done a lot of different stories where they don't like each other, where they're best friends, where they have a mutual admiration for each other. There's been all kinds of different things.
Have they ever fought each other?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Numerous times, actually. Yeah.
And who wins?
That's the thing. Like, if the theory is, and the big argument between fans are like, well, Superman could beat anybody. but Batman is like really smart and very strategic.
Right.
And like he knows Superman wouldn't want to beat him. Like he wouldn't want to hurt anybody. Like he uses Superman's good nature against him.
Psychological, right?
Yeah, and the theory is if you give Batman enough time to plan, he could beat him. Because he would trick him into going into a room that's full of kryptonite or whatever.
Right.
And, but if Superman just lost his mind and just used all his powers, he could just in 2 seconds grab Batman and throw him into the sun. I mean,
but they're both supposed to be good guys. So how does that work? They are both supposed to be good.
Well, they come up with all different stories
right.
that, one of them's controlled by an evil guy or something like that. It's the comic books.
Right.
There's a lot of different stuff.
Literally.
There's a lot of different stuff. Then there's the curse of Superman. I mentioned how George Reeve maybe killed himself, maybe was murdered, and he was still doing the Superman character at that point. The show was still on the air at that point. And then later Christopher Reeves, of course, very tragically was paralyzed from the neck down after he fell off a horse and passed away a few years ago now.
Yeah.
So there a lot of people were, even though it's just really the two of them, so I don't, and there have been other people, there have been a bunch of TV shows. Dean Cain played him on a TV show. Mm-hmm. There's been a reboot a few years ago with Brandon Roth, who played him in 2006 in a movie called Superman Returns, which didn't do that well.
Oh, right.
And then Henry Cavill most recently has played him, and those have been the most recent Superman movies.
Oh, okay.
And they were kind of tied in. They were trying to do like a connected universe where he had him interacting with all the other superhero characters from DC, like Batman and Wonder Woman and The Flash, kind of like they've been doing in the Marvel movies. And it never really quite did as well as the Marvel movies.
Right.
They were always kind of playing catch up with the Marvel movies, and, because that became such a big deal with Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans and, all the Avengers movies that they did. So a couple of years ago, they decided to just kind of reboot it and restart it because it just wasn't working. So that's where this new movie comes in.
Okay.
And that is going to be kicking off this new DC universe, and it's going to be all interconnected stuff again.
Now, do you know what the synopsis is? Like, does he come... Is it way back to when he? I don't know. Nobody knows.
I think it's going to kind of be like they've always kind of been there.
Okay.
And maybe they're relatively new to it, and people don't know them that well. But it's not going to be like there might be some flashbacks where they show his origin and stuff like that. But, it's kind of a running joke. Like, we have had numerous Superman movies, so we know what happened. Again, his planet blew up. They were sent here. He's Superman.
Yes.
Same thing with Batman. His parents were shot. He became a vigilante. He became Batman. We don't need to see that every single movie, even though they've done it numerous times in the movies and TV shows.
But what could the storyline be like? I mean, if you can imagine something.
The key, one of the great dynamics is his battles with Lex Luthor, because Lex Luthor again is also kind of like Batman, not super powered or anything, but he's got a lot of money and he's very smart.
Right.
So it does look like, from seeing the trailers, and the movie hasn't come out yet, so we don't really know, but it looks like Lex Luthor has always been jealous of Superman. Mm-hmm. And because he thinks everybody should treat him as the best because he's the smartest and he's the richest guy in the world. And so it looks like he's trying to discredit Superman and get people turning against him.
Okay.
And so he's trying to destroy him that way, kind of tear him down so he could beat him kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Which happens a lot in the comics.
Right.
It's a
familiar story.
Yeah. It's not particularly new. Now, so I mentioned that, he for years, of course, had the love affair with Lois Lane. Mm-hmm. And in the comics for decades, she didn't know he was Superman. And there was always the thing with Superman that he would put on his glasses and put on a suit and nobody would recognize him. He looked exactly the same. And apparently they're going to address that in some way in the new movie.
Okay.
They're going to make some, again, when these, same thing with Batman. Like, if you thought about it, you could figure out that it must be Bruce Wayne who's Batman, because it has to be somebody who's really rich, and he kind of has the same physique as Batman, so. But in the 30s, it was a simpler time.
Yeah, right. Of course.
There was no TV, there was no people taking pictures with their phones or anything like that.
You saw somebody go by, you had to remember what everyone looked like.
Exactly. So it could be, again, it was, you could maybe pass that off. I don't know if it would have worked because nobody actually did this stuff in the 30s. They weren't actually superheroes.
Right.
But, it's more conceivable, that this could happen. But eventually, like I said in the comic books, Lois Lane finds out who he is. They get married. And in the 90s, in 92, I believe it was, they had a story arc called The Death of Superman. Mm-hmm. Now, I want you to try and guess what happens in the story, The Death of Superman.
Big pile of kryptonite got him? Because that's the only way you can kill him? Oh, I thought he wasn't.
He came up against somebody who could actually beat him. He came up against a supervillain called Doomsday, which, pretty good name for a supervillain, But if you're workshopping supervillain names, that's a good one to go with because, it definitely sounds imposing,
Yeah.
So he gets beat up and he dies. Now, he gets better. Even though he died, he recovers and comes back. Like about 3 months later, there was the return of Superman, which, spoiler alert, he comes back. Mm-hmm. So, the whole death thing wasn't permanent. It's like that line, The Princess Bride, I've seen worse, when he's like, oh,
right, I've seen worse, he's only mostly dead.
Only mostly dead, exactly. So he got better. But that was like a huge thing. Like it was in the news and like people were talking like, oh my God, they're killing Superman. And
was it a film or was it in the comic strips?
No, it was in the comic books.
Oh,
they eventually made like an animated movie about it and they kind of adapted it in one of the Henry Cavill movies. Mm-hmm. But basically, it was a publicity stunt, essentially.
Of course, and it worked.
Obviously, and it sold like more comic books than any comic book ever,
right.
At that time. And
that was the 90s. Is that when in the 80s they used to kill people off like JR and stuff, and that for ratings,
right?
And then in soap operas, and then people would come back, and that was a thing.
Everybody comes back.
Yeah, that was a thing back then.
Death is not permanent when you're a popular character in extended media. So. There is a lot of talk about, especially in more modern times, about the symbolism of Superman. Mm-hmm. And this gets kind of deep because a lot of people say, he's an allegory for immigrants because he's an immigrant. He came to this planet as a stranger. And even though we don't really know that, but there is in the storylines in a lot of the comics. And again, this looks like it's going to be played out in the new movie. People are against him because they don't trust him because he's an alien.
He is an alien, I guess, right?
He's an alien
from another planet.
He is literally from another planet.
Which is ironic that he's called Superman.
He's not technically a human.
Right.
It's true. It's very, very true.
Yeah.
I think there is a line in the new movie where Lex Luthor says, Superman, he's neither one. Which he's not super and he's not a man. So, so exactly what you just said. Then there's also talk about religious themes in Superman.
Okay.
Now, the two gentlemen who made him, Siegel and Schuster, they were both Jewish, and a lot of people say that his story is kind of similar to Moses' story.
Oh, okay.
He was sent in the reeds. He was sent away by his family down the river, and, that was kind of like him being sent away, and he led the people to the promised land kind of thing. Both those guys said, no. We just wanted to do something kind of cool.
We're just cool. Superman. Pretty simple.
Exactly. We wanted to make somebody who could fly and beat up people. We weren't
likes
thinking.
The cape.
Yep. In more recent years, and especially since the Christopher Reeve movies came out, there's a Jesus allegory to him too. Mm-hmm. The only son of the father of Krypton being sent to Earth to rescue everyone.
Right.
So, and there are a lot of in a few of the movies, there's a lot of very heavy references to this.
Oh, really?
Like in the original Superman movie from 1978. His ship looks like a star, so that could be like the Star of Bethlehem.
Oh, okay.
For the birth of Jesus, and And he also in a couple of the movies, there's a couple of scenes where he's just kind of like out with his arms spread out, like floating in the sky. So kind of, very, very, it's not subtle by any stretch of the imagination. So they do kind of put that in there. And of course, some religious groups like this, some religious groups don't like this because, they're like, okay, maybe this got people interested in religion more, or this is blasphemous,
Sure.
So, but again, according to the creators, he's not Jesus, he's not Moses, he's Superman.
He's a Superman, right?
He's a super guy. He's pretty good. So what now? Have you ever watched any? I know you said you think you've seen one of the Christopher Reeves movies.
I think I was never a big Superman fan. I think he was a little bit too perfect.
Did you ever watch the Super Friends or any of the animated
the
shows?
Friends we watched.
He was in that. He was one of the Super Friends. He was pals with everybody.
He was too perfect almost.
That's the drawback of him.
Like to not I didn't have a crush on him. If I was to choose, I mean, not that you asked, but I think I would choose Batman. He's a little more mysterious.
Yeah,
right?
No, I get that.
Superman's like the good guy,
Yeah.
That's the one you marry. You don't date the good guy.
There's his nickname in the comic books among the other superheroes, like in the superhero universe, in his universe. Some people call him the Big Blue Boy Scout.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly it.
That is kind of it.
So it didn't appeal to a teenage girl for sure, I would tell you that.
Yeah. I get that. And, again, in a lot of ways, Batman is just kind of cooler.
Right. Yeah.
He's just kind of, again, too, he doesn't have these superpowers. So like you could say like, oh, I could be that, I could, if I had,
can aspire to it. Right.
Yeah. I could have a secret cave with all these gadgets and a cool car and, cape and, go out there and.
Sure. It's like an advertisement for capitalism too, right? I mean, if you want to go in now, it's like, okay, I'm going to be rich. Definitely. I'm going to be,
There's a couple of things with the comic books, as I mentioned, technically he started in 1938. So, and Batman started a few months after him. So they would all be like over 100 years old now at this point. So every now and then in comic books and in DC and Marvel, they do this. They have like an event that kind of resets the timeline, like some kind of evil alien who can control all time and space. Does this? They call them in DC Comics. They call them crises, like infinite crisis, like worlds merge, and they just kind of say like, okay, all that stuff over the last 80 years happened, but it happened like within the last 2 years.
Okay, right.
So they're always perpetually like in their mid 30s, I guess. Batman and Superman, they're not really. They don't really get old, although they have done comics where they show like what if they live, if they just kind of age normally and where they would be, And again, Superman is kind of immortal too, so he could like live 100 years technically, or several hundreds of years. But they did this one comic, probably I guess in the early 2000s. I'm not sure exactly when it came out, but it was called Red Sun. And what's interesting about it is it's the same story of Superman, but instead of landing in Kansas, he lands in Moscow.
Oh,
so he grows up in Soviet Russia.
Okay.
And he's like working for Stalin, and he's like, like a communist. And
is
Lex
he a
Luthor,
good guy still?
He's a good guy, but he's also thinks like the communist way is right. So he's kind of, he's definitely the United States doesn't like him. They're trying to stop him. And
it's interesting.
It's a fascinating comic book, and it kind of takes the whole Superman thing and flips it on its ear.
Right, because you're just taking for granted that he lands in America and everything is just, very American about him.
Yes, because he was made by Americans and he was it was published in America.
Of course,
but
didn't even occur to me. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And we as Americans tend to think we're the center of the universe anyway. Yes, so,
couldn't possibly land anywhere else on the earth.
Exactly. He's not going to land in Canada for crying out loud. That would be crazy. That would be ridiculous. Thank you for listening to The Last Radio Show. If you like the show, please subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review on your favorite platform. You can check us out on Facebook and Instagram at The Last Radio Show. We will talk to you soon.
The Last Radio Show.
The Last Radio Show.